The alien princess smirked. "You'll fall in seconds," then realized he wasn't the prey. The blade was already at his throat before the lights in the corridor finished flickering back on. Sergeant Caleb Durant had been awake for 31 hours. He had eaten half a protein bar somewhere around hour 20, drank nothing since hour 26, and had a bruise forming along his left ribs that made every breath feel like swallowing a small fire. None of that stopped him from noticing the exact angle of the wrist holding the blade, the slight tremor in the attacker's elbow, and the 3-inch gap between his left hand and the corridor wall. He did not move. The alien standing in front of him was tall. Taller than him by nearly a foot, which was saying something because Caleb was not a short man. She had silver-white skin that looked like someone had polished it, and her eyes were a deep amber that caught the emergency lighting and threw it back like two small fires. She wore armor that looked grown rather than made, dark and ridged along the shoulders, and her posture was the kind that came from people who had spent years being told they were better than everything around them. She was, by most definitions of the word, striking. She was also holding a blade to his throat, which meant that conversation was going to be interesting. "Human," she said. Her voice carried the slight click that all Verk did when they spoke in the common tongue, a residue of their own language beneath the translated words. "You are in a restricted corridor aboard a Verk command vessel. You are unarmed, you are alone, and you are in a position where I could remove your ability to breathe in approximately 2 seconds. Caleb said nothing. He was busy counting exits. "I am giving you the opportunity to explain yourself before I end this," she said. "That is more courtesy than most of my kind would offer." "Appreciated," he said. She blinked. It was a slow blink, the way someone blinks when they expected a different reaction and their body is taking a moment to catch up to the surprise. "You are not afraid." "I didn't say that." "Your heart rate is slow." "I can hear it." "That's a skill," he said. "Takes practice." Her head tilted just slightly to the left. It was the Verk version of a frown. He had learned that in the 3 weeks since the joint operation began. "You are being amused by this situation." "No," he said. "I'm being careful. There's a difference." The blade did not move. Neither did he. The corridor around them was dark except for the red emergency strips along the floor which painted everything in the color of old rust. Somewhere above them the ship was running on backup systems. That was his fault. Well, partially his fault. 60% his fault. He would accept 60. "What is your designation?" she asked. "Sergeant Caleb Durant, Coalition Special Operations, attached to the Joint Task Force." "You are far outside your assigned quarters, Sergeant Durant." "I go for walks when I can't sleep." "This section is restricted to Verk command personnel only. The signs are in 7 languages. Your language is one of them." "They are," he agreed, "very clear signage." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the neighborhood. "You are either very brave or very foolish." "My commanding officer says both. Says they look identical from the outside." For a moment, nothing happened. The ship hummed around them, the low vibration of engines running at minimum power, keeping them in orbit above the planet that neither side had a name for yet, and both sides wanted very badly. That was the whole reason this joint operation existed. That was the reason ships from 2 civilizations that did not particularly trust each other were sharing corridors and meals, and supposedly classified sensor data. That was also the reason Caleb had been awake for 31 hours, because someone had been feeding false positioning data into the joint sensor grid, and he had traced it to this section of the ship, and the person responsible had apparently noticed him doing so before he had found them. The blade at his throat was not a coincidence. "You traced the signal," she said. "It was not a question." "Yes." "Then you know what I am." "I have a working theory," he said. She studied him for a long moment. The amber eyes moved across his face the way someone reads a document they are not sure they trust. "You are not what I expected from a human soldier," she said finally. "What did you expect?" Panic, negotiation, begging. She said the last word with a flatness that made it clear she had seen all three many times and had never been impressed by any of them. Your kind tends toward noise when cornered. Some of us, he said, not all. You are still cornered. I know. You still have a blade at your throat. I know that too. The corner of her mouth moved. It was barely a movement, just a slight shift, but on a Verk face it was enormous. It was what passed for a smirk. You will fall in seconds if I choose it, she said. And yet you stand here making conversation with me, as though we met at a diplomatic function. We might as well, he said. We're not going anywhere. I could end this. You could, he said, but you haven't. The smirk faltered. It was small, that falter. A person who was not paying very close attention would have missed it entirely. But Caleb had spent the last 15 years of his life in environments where missing small things got people killed, and he had developed the kind of attention that most people found uncomfortable to be on the receiving end of. She had not expected him to say that. She had expected him to talk about consequences, about the joint operation, about diplomatic incidents and political fallout. That was what people said when they were trying to talk their way out of a blade at their throat. They appealed to reason, or they appealed to fear, or they appealed to self-interest. He had simply stated a fact. And the fact was this. She had been standing here for nearly 40 seconds, which was 38 seconds longer than it took to do what she had described. The blade had not moved, which meant something else was happening, something underneath the surface of this encounter, something that had been there from the moment she stepped into this corridor and found him already waiting. Because that was the other thing she had not processed yet. He had already been in the corridor when she arrived. He had not walked in after her. He had been there first. You knew I would come here, she said. Her voice had changed. The cool certainty was still there, but something under it had shifted, the way a foundation shifts when you realize the ground beneath it is not what you assumed. I knew someone would, he said. I was not sure it would be you specifically. You set the trace deliberately. Yes. You wanted whoever was feeding false data to come find you. Yes. That is, she stopped, search for the word, reckless. Or calculated, he said, depends on whether it works. The amber eyes held his for a long moment. The blade was still there. The corridor was still red and dark and humming. But something had changed in the geometry of this encounter. Some weight had shifted, and they both knew it even if neither of them said so directly. You are not prey, she said slowly. The words came out like she was reading them from a page she had not expected to find, like they surprised her even as she spoke them. No, he said. You came here knowing I might kill you. I came here because someone is going to get a lot of people killed if the false data isn't stopped. Verk and Coalition both. Whatever you think of humans, I don't think you came on this mission wanting to watch your own crew die alongside mine, because someone is playing a separate game. Silence. Then very slowly, the blade lowered. Not much, an inch, maybe two, but it lowered. You are, she said, very strange for a human. I get that a lot, Caleb said. Above them, the ship hummed. The planet turned somewhere outside the hull, and in a red-lit corridor on a Verk command vessel, something that was not quite trust and not quite respect but was somewhere in the territory between the two took its first small breath. Caleb did not relax. He never relaxed in corridors like this, on ships like this, with blades that were still technically in the air. But he let himself note the shift, filed it carefully, and waited for what came next. Her name was Commander Sarava Vel, and she made it very clear that telling him her name was not an act of trust. It is practicality, she said. If we are going to work together, calling you the human, and having you call me the Verk will become inefficient quickly. Agreed, Caleb said. Caleb works, or Durin if you prefer. Caleb, she repeated, the click of her natural language softening the hard consonant slightly. She seemed to taste the word, decide it was acceptable, and then move past it. She had sheathed the blade. That was something. It was still on her hip and her hand was close to it, but it was sheathed. Tell me what you found. They had moved off the main corridor and into a maintenance junction that smelled like recycled air and old metal. It was not comfortable. Caleb had sat on worse, and he imagined she had too. He pulled the small data tablet from the inside pocket of his jacket and turned it to face her. The false positioning data has been running for 6 days, he said. It started small, just minor drift adjustments in the sensor reporting, the kind of thing that looks like calibration error. Easy to miss if you're not looking for a pattern. Sarava studied the screen. Her eyes moved quickly, the way someone moves their eyes when they are very used to reading data and not wasting time. The drift adjustments cluster here, she said, pointing without touching. Around the third moon. Yes. That is where we are scheduled to deploy the joint survey team in 30 hours. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of confusion. The quiet of someone putting pieces together very quickly and not liking where they landed. If the survey team deploys using false positioning data. They land in the wrong location, Caleb said. Not dramatically wrong, just enough. Enough to put them within range of something that the correct data would show them to avoid. That's my read. You believe someone on this ship wants the joint survey team dead. I believe someone wants to make it look like an accident, he said, which is different but not by much. She straightened. Even sitting, she carried herself like someone who never fully let their guard down, which Caleb found both understandable and slightly exhausting. You said you did not know it would be me who came to this corridor. That's right. Who else did you suspect? He considered the question. He had a list. It was not a short list, and putting it in front of a Verk commander in a maintenance junction was the kind of move that could go several different directions. But she had lowered the blade. She had given him her name. She was asking questions that sounded like someone who wanted to stop something, not continue it. 3 names from the coalition side, he said, 2 from yours. Her expression did not change exactly, but something behind it did. You suspected Verk crew. The access logs for the sensor grid don't lie about species, he said. Someone with Verk-level command clearance touched the calibration files on day 1. That's not a human access code. You could have brought this to the Joint Command Council, she said. I could have, he agreed. And then whoever is doing this would know I found it, and the data would be scrubbed inside the hour, and we'd have nothing. And in 29 hours and some minutes, the survey team would still land exactly where someone wants them to land. So you walked into a restricted corridor alone and waited to be found. I walked into a restricted corridor alone and made enough noise with the trace algorithm that whoever touched those calibration files would feel the tug on the line, he said. I wanted to see who came running. Sarava looked at him for a long moment. It was the look of someone recalibrating their map of the world, which Caleb had seen before on human faces and apparently looked almost identical on Verk ones. You used yourself as bait. I used myself as a point of contact, he said. Bait implies I expected to be taken. I expected to be confronted. There is less difference between those 2 things than you seem to think. Maybe, he said, but I'm still here, so the calculation worked out. She made that almost sound again, the one that lived next to a laugh without quite being one. Tell me the names on your list. He did. He gave her the full 3 from the coalition side. A logistics officer named Prentice, who had been unusually curious about the sensor grid during the first week. A communications technician named Alicia Van, whose behavior had shifted noticeably after the data manipulation started, and a coalition science advisor named Gordon, who had requested access to the third moon's geological surveys 4 days before the false data appeared. He gave her the 2 Verk names more carefully, watching her face as he said them. She did not flinch at either name. She was too disciplined for flinching. but one of the names made her go very still in a way that was its own kind of answer. "You recognize that name," he said. "I recognize all names on a command vessel," she said. "It does not mean what you are implying." "I'm not implying anything, I'm watching." "You do a great deal of watching." "It's kept me alive." She stood up, which required ducking slightly in the low junction space, and he stood with her. They were close in the small room, close enough that he could see the faint bioluminescent lines along her collar, a very physiological trait that brightened slightly under stress. They were brighter than they had been when she first sheathed the blade. Whatever name on his list had meant something to her, it was still meaning something. "I need to verify the data independently," she said. "I know. I will need access to the sensor grid logs from my terminal." "I know. You are not going to argue about jurisdiction or chain of command." "No," he said, "are you?" She looked at him again. It was becoming a familiar experience, being on the receiving end of that look, and he was beginning to read its variations. This one was somewhere between assessment and something that might, over time and given the right conditions, become the early edge of respect. "You are trusting me with this," she said. "I am working with you on this," he said. "There's a difference. You keep drawing those distinctions. Words matter. Especially with people I've just met." "You have known me for," she checked, some internal calculation running behind her eyes, 14 minutes. "And in 14 minutes you've held a blade to my throat, given me your name and asked me good questions," he said. "That tells me a lot." "What does it tell you?" "That whatever you are or aren't, you want the survey team to land safely." She was quiet. "Then they are my crew, some of them." "Yes," he said, "I know." That quiet again. The maintenance junction hummed around them, a different frequency from the main corridors, something more mechanical and less polished. It was the sound of a ship being honest about what it actually was under all the diplomatic plating. "The individual whose name made you react," Caleb said carefully, "are they someone you would have expected?" She took a long time before answering. "No," she said, "they are not." "Then we're looking for someone who is good at being unexpected." That is not a reassuring description. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." They worked out the next steps in quiet efficiency. Sarava would access the sensor logs from her terminal without triggering an alert. Caleb would go back to his assigned quarters, which would require taking a route that bypassed the 2 Verk security checkpoints that would log his return time and location, but he had already worked that out before he walked into the corridor the first time. She would send him a verification signal through the joint data channel, using a frequency that would look like standard calibration noise to anyone monitoring. He had a contact on the coalition side who could cross-reference the human access codes without going through official channels. Not Prentice, not Van, not Gordon. Someone quieter and less visible. A woman named Lieutenant Dora Keene, who had been his signals analyst for 2 years, and who he trusted the way you trust a person who has pulled you out of a burning structure twice and never once asked for credit. "If we find confirmation," Sarava said, "we cannot go to the Joint Command Council." "Not until we know who in the council is clean," he agreed. "That is an uncomfortable position." "Yes," he said. "It is. You seem comfortable in uncomfortable positions." "I've had practice." She looked at him one final time in the dim maintenance light, and this time the assessment was complete. She had made a decision. He could see it in the way she held herself, a fractional lowering of the shoulder, the kind of thing that happens when the body agrees with what the mind has already chosen. "I will send the verification signal within 2 hours," she said. "If you do not receive it, assume I have been compromised." "And if I'm compromised?" "Then the signal will not matter," she said, "because the survey team will die, and this conversation will have been the last useful thing either of us did." "Cheerful," he said. "Accurate," she replied. She moved toward the junction door, stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back once. "Sergeant Durant," she said. "Yeah." You are strange for a human, I said that before. You did. I have decided, she said slowly, that it may not be an insult. She left before he could respond to that, which he suspected was intentional. He stood alone in the maintenance junction for exactly 30 seconds, letting the ship hum around him and letting his mind run through the next 8 hours the way you walk a route before you run it. He had 30 names memorized from the crew manifest of this vessel, Coalition and Verk both. He had 5 faces attached to the names he had given her, and 7 faces attached to names he had not. He had a signal route planned, a fallback position mapped, and 2 contingencies built for the scenarios where things went wrong in the ways he expected. He did not have a contingency for Saravavel. That was interesting. He filed it carefully, the way he filed everything useful, in the part of his mind that he would return to when the immediate situation allowed for reflection. Right now, the immediate situation required him to walk 20 meters of Verk corridor, past 1 security checkpoint using a maintenance override code he had memorized 4 days ago, through a service passage that ran parallel to the Coalition quarters block, and into his bunk without anyone who was watching the ship's movement logs, understanding that he had ever been anywhere he was not supposed to be. He had done harder things on less sleep. He moved. The corridor was empty. The red emergency lighting had shifted back to standard yellow-white, which meant the backup power sequence was cycling through its return phase. He kept his steps even and his breathing slow, and he did not look at the security camera in the upper left corner of Checkpoint 7, because looking at cameras was what people did when they were thinking about cameras. He thought about the third moon instead. He thought about a survey team of 12, 6 Coalition and 6 Verk, dropping into a landing zone that someone had moved 40 meters southeast on a false map. He thought about what was 40 meters southeast of the correct landing zone, which he had studied from the geological surveys the same day he noticed the data drift. He thought about that, and his steps stayed even and his breathing stayed slow. In his quarters, 3 minutes later, he sat on the edge of his bunk and pulled out the second data tablet, the one that was not connected to the ship's network and never had been. He began to write down everything he knew, everything he suspected, and everything that did not yet fit the shape of what he was seeing. He was on his 3rd page when the joint data channel showed a flicker of calibration noise that was not calibration noise at all. Sarava had been faster than 2 hours, considerably faster. Either she was very motivated or she had already had her own suspicions, and he had simply been the confirmation she was waiting for. Both possibilities were interesting. He sent back a response in the same camouflaged frequency, 4 characters that would look like sensor noise and meant, confirmed, proceeding. Then he lay back on the bunk, stared at the ceiling of a Verk vessel that smelled faintly of mineral oil and something sweet he had no name for, and gave himself exactly 20 minutes to sleep before the next phase started. He set an internal alarm, the kind trained into him over 15 years of operations where external alarms were a luxury, and closed his eyes. 27 hours until deployment. He had worked with less. Lieutenant Dora Keene had the kind of face that people forgot 5 minutes after meeting her, which she considered her greatest professional asset. She was not plain. She was not invisible. She simply had the rare talent of presenting herself in a way that slid off the attention of everyone around her like water off polished stone. She had spent 11 years cultivating it, and it had saved her life on 4 separate occasions, and it was the primary reason that Caleb Durant trusted her with things he did not trust to anyone else. She received his message through the channel they had agreed on 18 months ago, during a joint force briefing on the Marrow station that had officially been about communications protocols, and unofficially been about the fact that someone on the coalition side had been passing targeting data to a third party for 6 weeks. The message came disguised as a routine maintenance inquiry from the engineering deck. It took her 40 seconds to strip the surface layer and read the actual content, and another 10 seconds to understand what he was asking. She did not reply immediately. She closed the tablet, finished her meal in the coalition mess hall alongside 8 other crew members who were all talking about the survey mission with the particular enthusiasm of people who were looking forward to going planetside. And then she walked very calmly to the small data station in Corridor 7 that was technically for navigation verification and almost never used. She pulled the access logs. She was careful about it. She did not pull the full logs, which would have flagged her query. She pulled a subset, framed as a cross-reference for a trajectory calculation she did not actually need, and she read what she found with her expression set to the mild concentration of someone checking math. What she found made her very still inside, in the way that she had learned to be still inside when the world was moving faster than it looked. She sent Caleb a response through the same channel 20 minutes later. He read it in his bunk, on the second tablet, with the ship humming around him and the 20 minutes of sleep he had promised himself already spent. The message was 7 words, formatted as a navigation verification number. The 7 words, stripped of their cover, said, "It is not who you think." He sat up. He had a list of 5 people on the human side who had access, motive, or opportunity. Dora's message told him that the logs pointed somewhere outside that list, which meant either the access had been faked, the identity had been borrowed, or he had missed someone. He spent the next 4 minutes going back through his notes, and then he saw it. He had missed someone, not because the evidence was hidden, because the evidence was right in front of him and he had categorized it wrong, filed it under a different problem, and moved on. It was the kind of mistake that happened when you were running on too little sleep and too much information, and your brain started making connections that felt right but were actually just familiar. The communications technician, Alicia Van, had not shifted her behavior after the data manipulation started. She had shifted her behavior the day before it started. He had noted the date and filed it as prior stress response, unrelated, and moved on because the shift was subtle, and because Alicia Van was 24 years old and 3 months into her first deployment and stress responses were common. He had given her the benefit of the doubt. That had been a mistake. He pulled up Van's service record on the ship's public manifest, which anyone on the coalition crew could access. 24 years old, graduated the Communications Academy 14 months ago, posted to this mission as part of a broader exchange initiative. Clean record, strong evaluations. Family background showed a father in civilian shipping, a mother who worked in habitat design, 2 younger siblings. Nothing that explained it. He went deeper, to the information he had quietly gathered during his first week aboard, the kind of ambient intelligence that was not in any official file. Van had a friend from the academy who was not on the ship. She spoke to that friend via personal channel 3 times in the first week, then stopped. She had been seen twice in conversation with the coalition science advisor, Gordon, in the forward observation bay. Conversations that had looked casual and both times ended abruptly when other crew members approached. Gordon again. He started building a different map. 90 minutes before he had walked into that restricted corridor, he had believed Gordon was a secondary suspect, possible but not primary. Now he pulled that assumption out and looked at it from the other side, and what he saw changed the shape of everything. Gordon had been on 3 previous Joint Force operations. On 2 of them, the geological survey teams had reported anomalous findings that were subsequently classified. Caleb had not known that. He knew it now because Dora, in her 7 disguised words, had included a reference number that corresponded to a public mission record, one he had never looked at because it predated this mission by 6 years, and he had not thought to look backward. He looked backward now. The 3rd moon of this unnamed planet was not geologically interesting in ways that most people would care about. It was not a place for colonies or resource extraction or scenic vistas. But it was interesting in one very specific way that required a trained eye to recognize, and Gordon had a trained eye, and Gordon had requested the geological surveys 4 days before the false positioning data appeared. Caleb spent 8 minutes thinking very carefully. Then he sent a second message to Dora. This one was longer, disguised as a calibration sequence. It told her 3 things. Gordon was the primary, Van was secondary and possibly not willing, and the name Caleb had given Sarava that made her go still was probably not involved but needed to be cleared to be certain. Then he did something he had not planned to do. He sent a message to Sarava through the calibration channel. It was a risk. Their arrangement had been simple. She would verify from her side, he would verify from his, and they would compare. Reaching out ahead of schedule implied a change in circumstances, and changes in circumstances made cautious people nervous. Sarava was, by every indication he had gathered, a cautious person. But she was also fast. Faster than expected, which meant she was motivated, which meant she would rather know early than late. The message was 4 words: "Adjust your list, Gordon." He waited. The response came in 11 minutes, which was faster than the first one had been, and it was not calibration noise this time. It was a precise sequence that he had to decode manually, which told him she was being careful about their channel. The decoded message said, "The Verk name you gave me is clear. I have something new. How soon can you move?" He checked the time. 19 hours and 43 minutes until deployment. He wrote back 1 hour where. She sent coordinates. Not a corridor location, a junction number from the engineering submap, 2 decks below the crew quarters and 1 level above the drive maintenance bay. It was a place that appeared on both the Verk and Coalition ship schematics because it was part of the shared infrastructure section, which meant technically either crew had legitimate reason to be there. It was also a place that had no standard security cameras, because the camera installation schedule had been delayed and both sides had agreed to defer it until after the mission. A small administrative gap that someone had noticed, and neither side had bothered to close. He got off the bunk. He took 12 minutes to move through the ship, using 4 different route segments and pausing twice in locations that would log his presence somewhere benign. By the time he arrived at the junction coordinate, he had a very clean navigational record that showed him visiting the Water Reclamation Monitor Station and the Secondary Communications Relay Room, both within his legitimate access range. Sarava was already there. She was standing in the center of the junction with her arms crossed, which he was beginning to understand was not defensiveness in Verk body language, but rather concentration. Something was happening behind her amber eyes, a kind of rapid processing that showed itself in the slight tension of her jaw and the bioluminescent lines at her collar, which were brighter again. "You found Gordon," she said before he could speak. "Yes. I found something else." She moved to the wall panel and pulled it open. Behind it, tucked against the conduit housing in a way that suggested it had been placed there by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, was a small device. Maybe 6 centimeters long, matte gray, unremarkable to anyone who was not looking for it. Caleb looked at it without touching it. "Signal repeater," he said. "Modified," she said. "It is not transmitting to the survey team's navigation system." "What is it transmitting to?" "Something on the surface," she said. "On the 3rd moon. Something that is not in our survey data because it was not there when the survey data was gathered." He straightened slowly. "Someone put something on the moon between when we gathered the data and now." "Yes," she paused. "It is a Verk signal pattern. The repeater is keyed to a Verk frequency." He thought about that carefully, which means whoever did this wanted it to look Verk. "Or it is Verk," she said. "And someone on my ship is more deeply involved than I believed." "Do you trust your read of the crew?" "I trust my read of the crew," she said, "the same way you trust your list, imperfectly with the knowledge that I might be wrong." "Fair," he said. "The device on the moon," she said. "Whatever it is what the positioning data is pointing the survey team toward. So the goal is not to kill the team. The goal is to bring the team to that device. She looked at him. You reached the same conclusion. 40 minutes ago, he said. I needed confirmation. Capture, she said. Not assassination. A joint survey team, 6 Coalition and 6 Verk, found at an unauthorized location on an unclaimed world, in proximity to a Verk frequency device. The political implications alone would end the joint operation, he said. At minimum, depending on how it was framed, it could do much more damage than that. She was very still. Someone wants the Coalition and the Verk to stop cooperating. Someone wants us to stop cooperating very badly, he said, and they are willing to sacrifice 12 people to make it happen. The junction hummed. Somewhere above them, the ship continued its slow orbit, indifferent to what was being worked out 2 decks below. Gordon cannot act alone, Sarava said. The positioning data requires Verk access codes to modify. We established this. Yes. So there is someone on my crew who is working with him. Yes. And the name I cleared, she said. You are still certain? Dora cleared the logs, he said. I trust her read. She absorbed that. Absorbed the fact that he had a person whose judgment he trusted, the same way she had been silently weighing her own crew for the last hour. It was the kind of detail that mapped onto a shared experience, and he watched her recognize it. We have 19 hours, she said. 18 and some. We cannot go to Joint Command. Not without knowing who is clean. Then we need to identify Gordon's contact on my crew, she said, and we need to do it without alerting either of them that we are close. Yes. And then we fix the positioning data, he said. We remove the device. We find out what was supposed to be found. And then we figure out who authorized any of this, because Gordon and 1 Verk crew member are not doing this alone either. She looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. It was not quite the assessment look. It was something slightly more forward-facing, something that looked at the horizon instead of the ground. You already have a plan, she said. I have the beginning of one. Tell me. So he did. The plan had 4 stages, and only the first 3 were clean. Stage 1 was information. They needed to identify the Verk crew member working with Gordon before either of them knew they had been found. Sarava had 3 candidates after she eliminated the people she could personally verify, and she walked Caleb through each one with the kind of methodical detail that made him understand. She had been doing this kind of work far longer than her current role suggested. The 3 candidates were a navigation officer named Sarek, who had filed 2 access requests to the sensor grid that had been approved by someone other than his direct supervisor. A junior science liaison named Veth, who had been observed by Sarava, personally making a private communication channel request outside of standard hours, and a logistics coordinator named Paul who had, quietly and with good paperwork, moved 2 supply crates from the storage section into a maintenance corridor in the aft section 4 days ago. The crates were small, the kind that held equipment, the kind that held, for instance, a device roughly 6 centimeters long, matte gray, built to a Verk frequency specification. Paul, Caleb said. Paul, Sarava agreed. Stage 2 was containment. They could not arrest anyone, could not alert anyone, and could not have this conversation in the ship's official record. What they could do was ensure that Paul and Gordon were being watched, closely enough that any attempt to communicate with each other or adjust the plan would be noticed. Dora handled Gordon. She was, Caleb explained, exceptional at being in the right place at the wrong time for people who were doing things they should not be doing. She had a talent for ambient presence that bordered on the supernatural. He sent her a message through the calibration channel, and she confirmed receipt in 6 minutes. Sarava handled Paul through a Verk crew member she trusted enough to use, but not enough to fully brief. A weapons specialist named Aaron who owed her a debt of the professional kind, and who asked no questions when she told him to simply keep eyes on the logistics coordinator and report anything unusual. Stage 3 was the signal device. The repeater in the junction wall needed to be disabled without triggering whatever protocol it was connected to on the moon's surface. If the signal dropped suddenly, the device on the moon might respond in a way they could not predict, and with 12 crew members scheduled to land in the general vicinity within 16 hours, unpredictable responses were not acceptable. Caleb spent 40 minutes in the junction with the device, not touching it, just looking, running through what he knew about signal architecture from 6 years of working in environments where people used exactly this kind of quiet, embedded technology to do things that required distance and deniability. "You know this type," Sarava said. She was sitting on a conduit housing nearby, watching him work. She had stopped asking questions and started just observing, which he found easier to work around than the questions had been. "I've dismantled 3, he said, "or something close enough." "Where?" "Somewhere I'm not going to tell you about right now," he said. "But the principle is the same. The repeater is not just transmitting, it's also listening." "For what?" "For a confirmation pulse," he said. "Every 12 hours, whatever it's talking to on the moon sends back a confirmation that it's still active. If the repeater doesn't respond, the device triggers." "Triggers what?" "I don't know yet," he said. "But whatever it is, it's not good. Nobody builds a 12-hour dead man confirmation into a signal relay unless the thing on the other end needs to know the relay is still in place." She was quiet for a moment. "When was the last confirmation pulse?" 7 hours ago, he said. "Which means we have 5 hours before the next one. Can you intercept the pulse and send a false confirmation?" "Yes," he said, "but I need someone who knows this architecture better than I do." "Dora." "She's on Gordon. I need someone who knows Verk's signal design." Sarava looked at him for a moment. Then she made a decision, the kind of decision that had the clean, slightly irreversible quality of stepping off a ledge. "I know Verk's signal design," she said. He turned to look at her fully for the first time since they had arrived in the junction. "You're a commander." "Commanders are not born commanders," she said. "I spent 4 years in electronic intelligence before I was promoted to a field command. I have dismantled 6 devices of this general category." She paused. "Or something close enough." He held her gaze for a moment, and then something that was almost a smile crossed his face. "Useful," he said. "I assumed you would find it so." They worked together on the device for the next hour and 20 minutes. It was close, careful work, the kind where you had to be certain before you moved and certain again before you moved the next thing, because uncertainty in this context had consequences that spread outward in circles. She knew Verk's signal architecture the way someone knows a language they grew up speaking, and he knew how to read the intent behind hardware the way someone knows how to read a room. And together, they made progress that either of them alone would have taken 3 times as long to achieve. They intercepted the incoming confirmation pulse from the moon's device. They built a response that mimicked the repeater's signature closely enough to pass. They sent it. Then they sat back and waited to see if the moon's device believed them. The junction was quiet. The ship hummed. Sarava's bioluminescent lines had settled to a low, steady glow which Caleb had begun to understand was the Verk equivalent of controlled calm, not relaxed, just contained. "If this works," she said, "we buy ourselves another 12 hours. "If it works," he agreed. "In 12 hours, the survey mission will have been canceled or rerouted, and all of this will be in Joint Command's hands." "That's the hope." "What is the 4th stage?" she asked. He had known she would ask. He had been thinking about how to answer since he outlined the first 3 stages in this same junction, and he had not yet found a version of the answer that sounded as clean as the first 3. "The 4th stage is Gordon's authorization," he said. "He did not plan this alone. He received instructions from somewhere. Someone decided this joint operation should fail, and they chose Gordon as their instrument, and they found someone on your crew to partner with him. That chain does not end with Gordon. You want to trace it upward. I want to trace it far enough that it can't be cut off cleanly when we report it, he said. If we hand over Gordon and Paul and nothing else, whoever is at the top of this walks away and finds a different instrument for the next mission. She was very still. You are describing an intelligence operation that extends beyond this ship. Yes. You are describing something that would take weeks, months possibly. Yes. We have 16 hours. I know, he said. The fourth stage is the beginning of something, not the end of it. I'm not going to finish it here, but I need to gather enough in the next 16 hours that the thread doesn't go cold when we surface. She thought about that. What do you need? Gordon's communication records, he said. The ones outside the official channel he's been sending somewhere. Whoever gave him his instructions is at the end of those transmissions. Accessing his private communications without authorization is technically an overreach, he said. Yes, I know. If this surfaces in a legal review, then I answer for it, he said. That's my calculation to make. She looked at him. You are very comfortable accepting consequences. I've had practice with that too. A pause, then quietly. I can pull Paul's communication logs without triggering a flag. As his commanding officer, I have oversight authority. If Gordon and Paul communicated through a shared private channel, I will have Gordon's transmissions from Paul's end. He had not asked her to do that. He had not suggested it, had not implied it, had not laid out the path and waited for her to walk it. She had simply seen where the gap was and stepped into it, and the fact that she had offered without being asked told him more about her than the hour and a half they had just spent working on the device. That could be a professional risk for you, he said. Most things worth doing carry professional risk, she said. I decided that some time ago. How long ago? She considered. Approximately 14 minutes after a human sergeant used himself as bait in a restricted corridor and then explained to me why he was not prey, she said. I found it instructive. He did not have an answer for that. He let it sit, the way you let something sit when you are not sure what shape it is yet, but you know it is not nothing. They heard from Dora 20 minutes later, through the calibration channel, and what Dora had found changed the timeline significantly. Gordon had not been waiting for deployment. He had been transmitting already, from a personal device that used a civilian frequency embedded in the ship's standard communication noise. He had sent 4 messages in the last 6 hours. The first 3 were status updates, phrased in language that looked like personal correspondence and was not. The 4th, sent 40 minutes ago, was a question. Dora had decoded the question. It said, in essence, why has the repeater gone quiet? Caleb read that and felt the floor shift slightly under the plan. Gordon knew the repeater's status, which meant Gordon could tell the repeater had not sent its natural pulse, which meant, even if their intercepted pulse had worked on the moon's end, Gordon now knew something had changed on the ship. He showed Sarava. Her expression did not change, but the bioluminescent lines brightened sharply. He knows, she said. He suspects, Caleb said. He sent a question, he has not sent an alarm. He is waiting to see what happens. Which gives us a window, he said, small one. How small? He thought about Gordon, what he knew of the man from 3 weeks of observation and 2 days of active tracking. Gordon was methodical. Gordon was careful. Gordon was the kind of person who sent a question before an alarm, because he did not want to move too fast on incomplete information. He'll wait 4 hours before he escalates, Caleb said. Maybe 5 if he's particularly cautious. We have 16 hours to the survey mission and 4 hours before Gordon escalates, she said. That changes the sequence. Yes. We need to move the containment forward. Yes. And we cannot wait for Paul's logs. No, he said, we can't. She stood up from the conduit housing. The amber eyes were very clear, very focused, the way they had been when she first lowered the blade in the corridor and he had watched her decide to change direction. Then we are moving to stage 4 now, she said. Before we have finished stages 1 through 3. Yes, he said, can you manage that? She gave him a look that reminded him, briefly, of his first commanding officer, a woman named Colonel Patris Dunn, who had spent 30 years making impossible things happen in inconvenient timeframes, and who had the permanent expression of someone who found the word can't mildly amusing. I can manage it, Sarava said. Good, he said. Then here is what we are going to do. He told her and she listened, and neither of them flinched. 13 hours and 40 minutes until the survey mission. 4 hours until Gordon made a decision about the question he had sent. They had been in the junction for nearly 3 hours. They had taken a Verk signal device apart and rebuilt its pulse without triggering an alarm. They had identified 2 conspirators inside a ship full of people who were supposed to be allies. They had mapped a chain that reached far beyond this vessel. And somehow, in the space between a blade at his throat and a confirmation pulse on a moon he could not see, something had formed between them that neither of them had a word for yet. Caleb was not the kind of person who named things before they were fully formed. He filed it carefully, in the part of his mind that he returned to when the work allowed. Then he moved. Gordon was in the forward observation bay when they found him, standing at the wide, curved viewport with his hands behind his back, watching the unnamed planet rotate below. He did not turn around when they entered. He had heard them coming, or he had expected them, which was perhaps the same thing by this point. The observation bay was empty except for him, which Caleb thought was either a coincidence or a choice, and he had stopped believing in coincidences 3 days ago. I sent a question, Gordon said to the viewport. I did not expect a personal reply. We thought it deserved one, Caleb said. Gordon turned then. He was a compact man, late 40s, with the kind of face that collected expressions and gave none of them away easily. He looked at Caleb first, then at Sarava, and then back at Caleb, and in the 2 seconds of that survey, something behind his eyes made a calculation and arrived at a result he did not visibly react to. Commander Vell, he said, I was not expecting Verk involvement at this level. I imagine there are several things about this conversation you were not expecting, Sarava said. He looked at her steadily. You are both outside your official capacities. Yes, Caleb said. This conversation cannot be used in any formal proceeding. You'd be surprised what can be used, Caleb said. But let's not talk about proceedings right now. Let's talk about the device on the moon. A pause, minimal, controlled. I don't know what you mean. The signal repeater in Junction 7, Sarava said. The confirmation pulse you intercepted from the moon's surface. The positioning data that was going to walk 12 crew members 40 meters southeast of where they intended to land. Another pause, longer this time, and something moved behind Gordon's careful face. He had expected to be found. Caleb was now fairly certain of that. He had not expected to be found this thoroughly, or this early, or by a coalition of people that crossed the very line he had spent 6 days trying to exploit. You worked together, Gordon said. He was not asking. Yes, Caleb said. That was not anticipated. No, Sarava said, it was not. Gordon looked at the planet again. The unnamed world turned slowly beneath the ship, indifferent and enormous, blue-white and brown at the edges where the continents gave way to ice. Whatever was on the third moon was invisible from here, too small and too far, but Caleb watched Gordon look in that direction anyway. The way people look at things they have spent weeks planning around even when they cannot see them. What do you want? Gordon said. The name of whoever gave you your instructions, Caleb said. Gordon made a sound that was not quite a laugh. You understand that is not something I can. You have 2 options, Sarava said. Her voice was even, unhurried, with the particular flatness of someone who has decided what is going to happen and is simply describing it to someone who hasn't yet caught up. You give us the name, or the communication logs that Lieutenant Keene has already secured, along with the logs I pulled from Paul's terminal this morning, are submitted to the Joint Command Council in their entirety. Both chains, both directions. Paul is already in quarters restricted to his own section, pending my authority as his commanding officer. You are standing in an observation bay talking to us because you chose to be here rather than because you are free to go. Gordon was very still. The person who gave you your instructions, Caleb said, is going to know this operation failed within the next 6 hours regardless. Gordon, they have contingencies. You do not benefit from protecting them. You don't know who you're asking me to name. No, Caleb said. That's why I'm asking. The observation bay was quiet. The planet turned. The ship hummed around all three of them like a living thing that had no opinion about what was happening in its bones. Gordon turned away from the viewport and sat down in one of the observer chairs. It was a movement that had surrender in it, but a specific kind, the surrender of someone who has run the remaining calculations and found that every path leads to the same place. He was not defeated. He was choosing the least damaging option from a list where all options had costs. I was contacted 8 months ago, he said. Before this mission was announced, someone knew it was coming before the official channels did. Name, Sarava said. Gordon gave it. The name was not a coalition name. It was not a Verk name. It was a name that belonged to a member species of the broader interstellar network that both the coalition and the Verk Dominion were peripherally connected to. A civilization called the Dravathi, who were publicly neutral in most political matters and privately invested in the continued failure of coalition Verk cooperation for reasons that went back 60 years, and a resource dispute that had never been fully resolved. Caleb knew the name, not personally, as a context, a background fact, the kind of thing that sat in intelligence briefings as a note in the margin. He looked at Sarava. She was very still in the way that meant she also knew the name, possibly better than he did, and what she knew about it was not reassuring. How long has the Dravathi been positioning people in joint operations? She asked Gordon. This is the 3rd mission, he said, that I know of. The previous 2, Caleb said. The survey anomalies on Marrow Station and the incident on the Relay 7 corridor, Gordon said. Both resulted in coalition Verk friction. Both were attributed to miscommunication. Both were Dravathi operations, Sarava said. It was not a question. Both were, Gordon confirmed. Caleb thought about Colonel Dunn, who had spent 6 months untangling the Relay 7 incident and had never been fully satisfied with the official conclusion. He thought about the intelligence briefing where the Dravathi note in the margin had been added, which was not 6 months ago and not a year ago. It was 3 years ago. Someone had been watching this pattern for 3 years and not connected the thread. You will give a full accounting to the Joint Command Council, Sarava said. Every communication, every instruction, every contact. You will do so under joint authority, which means both Coalition and Verk Command will have access to your testimony simultaneously. And in return, Gordon said. In return, Caleb said, the 12 people on the survey mission land safely, which is the only thing that should matter to you right now if any part of your original purpose still means anything. Gordon was quiet for a moment. Then, Paul did not know the full scope, he said. He was told it was a positioning exercise, a calibration test. He did not know about the device on the moon. Sarava's expression shifted. Not much, but Caleb had learned to read the small movements, and this one said that Gordon had just given her something she had not expected and had not asked for. That is useful to know, she said. I am aware, Gordon said. I am telling you anyway. They took him to the Joint Command Council's meeting room, which required crossing 3 corridors and 1 checkpoint, and which they did quietly and with Gordon walking between them at a pace that looked, to anyone watching, like 3 colleagues moving between sections. The ship had resumed full lighting and full systems. The survey mission clock was ticking. Dora was waiting outside the meeting room with a data tablet and the expression of someone who had been up all night and had made her peace with it. She handed Caleb the tablet without a word, which was very Dora, and the tablet contained everything she had gathered from Gordon's communications, organized in the clean, cross-referenced way that she organized everything. He showed it to Sarava. She looked at it for 30 seconds and then nodded once. They went in. The Joint Command Council was 7 people. 4 coalition, 3 Verk, including the 2 commanding officers of their respective ship contingents. Both commanding officers had been briefed by their section heads that there was a priority matter requiring the Council's immediate attention, which was the language that cleared morning schedules without specifying why. What happened in the next 2 hours was not a comfortable conversation. It was a necessary one, which was different. Gordon gave his account. Dora's logs were presented. Sarava laid out the communication chain from Paul's terminal, including Paul's account, which she had taken that morning, and which confirmed that he had not known the full scope of what he was participating in. The name Gordon gave was received with the particular silence of people who had just been handed a piece of information that rearranged a large part of what they thought they understood. The survey mission was rerouted to the correct coordinates. The device on the moon was flagged for retrieval by a joint security team rather than an unarmed survey crew. The positioning data was corrected before anyone boarded the landing craft. The 12 crew members who had been scheduled to land 40 meters southeast of where they intended never knew how close that miscalculation had come to defining the rest of their lives. Caleb stood at the back of the meeting room while the council worked through the immediate protocols. He had given his report, answered questions, and been thanked in the particular formal way of institutions that are still processing the fact that 2 people they did not assign to a task had solved it before they knew the task existed. Sarava stood nearby. Not beside him exactly, but in the same general space, which on a Verk vessel and in a Verk context was a specific thing to do. It was the positioning of someone who has decided, at least for the moment, that this is where they choose to be. He thought about 14 minutes, about a maintenance junction and a signal device, and 43 minutes of calibration work done shoulder to shoulder with someone from a civilization that had not trusted his for the better part of 2 decades. About the blade that had been lowered, and the name that had been given, and the plan that had moved through 4 stages and arrived, imperfectly but successfully, at a morning where 12 people were boarding a survey craft for a planet they would land on safely. The council chair asked Caleb a final question before he was formally released from the briefing. The question was, how did you know to trust Commander Vell? He thought about it for a moment. She lowered the blade before I asked her to, he said. That told me enough. The chair looked at Sarava. How did you know to trust Sergeant Durant? Sarava considered the question with the same careful attention she gave everything. He walked into a restricted corridor alone, she said, and waited for whoever was doing harm to come find him. He did that because he believed stopping the harm was worth the personal risk. She paused. That is not a calculation most people make. I found it worth understanding. The chair looked between the 2 of them for a moment. Then he moved on to the next item on the agenda, which was the formal communication to the Dravathi Neutral Council, which was going to be a long and very unpleasant conversation. In the corridor outside the meeting room, Caleb and Sarava stood in the low morning hum of a ship settling into its day. The 4th stage, she said. It does not end here. No, he said. It doesn't. 3 operations at minimum, probably more we don't know about. The thread goes back further than Relay 7. That is not a short investigation. No. It is the kind of investigation, she said carefully, that would benefit from continuity, from people who understand both sides of the joint framework. He looked at her. She was looking at the middle distance in the way she did when she was thinking about something she had not fully decided yet. "I could request a cross-assignment," he said. "Coalition Special Operations has a liaison program. It's rarely used because nobody wants to spend 6 months on a Verk vessel." "Nobody until recently," she said. "Nobody until recently," he agreed. She turned to look at him. The amber eyes were very clear in the corridor light, and the bioluminescent lines at her collar were at their steady, low glow, the one that meant she was not alarmed or processing emergency data but was simply present, awake, paying attention. "You would not find it unpleasant," she said, "6 months aboard." "I find most things manageable," he said, "given reasonable company." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite the smirk that had been there in the corridor, hours and what felt like years ago, the one that had said "you will fall in seconds." This was something different, quieter, the kind of expression that lives on the other side of a smirk once the person wearing it has found something more interesting than being right. "Reasonable," she said, "that is a very careful word." "I use words carefully," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have noticed." She turned and walked back toward the Verk section of the ship, and he watched her go, and he thought about 14 minutes and signal pulses and the particular silence of an engineering junction, where two people were working on the same problem from two different directions, and finding, improbably, that they arrived at the same answers. He thought about Dora, who would absolutely refuse to be surprised by any of this, and would also refuse to say so directly. He thought about the thread that ran from a maintenance corridor on the ship back through 3 operations and 60 years of political maneuvering, to a name spoken quietly in an observation bay by a man who had made the calculation, and found that the least costly thing he could do was tell the truth. The thread was long, he had the beginning of it. He went to find Dora. The unnamed planet turned below them, and the ship moved in its orbit, and somewhere on the 3rd moon, a small gray device sat quietly waiting for a pulse that would not come, because the people it had been designed to deceive had already found a better use for the hours it had bought them. The survey mission launched on schedule. All 12 crew members landed exactly where they intended to land.